Welcome and thank you all for joining our webinar today. My name is Amaya Vijayasinghe and I'm a program officer here at UNEP-WCMC, working on the Trade Development and Environment Hub, or Trade Hub, funded by UK Research and Innovation's Global Challenges Research Fund. We are very happy to welcome you to the third webinar of the Trade Hub's Trade and Nature Trade-off and Solutions series. The purpose of this series is to identify and share case studies, present recent findings from our work, and demonstrate the impact of our work here at the Trade Hub. But today especially, we're using the convening power of the Trade Hub and bringing together a panel of experts to discuss trade, biodiversity, and climate change. So in the aftermath of COP26, I think there's no longer any doubt that the climate and nature agendas have truly converged, as many agree that this was the most nature-focused climate COP ever. It may take a little more time for nature to take center stage at the formal negotiations, but biodiversity and nature had a strong presence among the commitments, pledges, and larger halo of activities that took place around COP26 and was a part of the conversations on adaptation, mitigation, and overall resilience. And global trade plays and will continue to play a significant role in how these pledges for climate and biodiversity play out over the next 9 years, up to 2030 and beyond. So following on from this momentum at COP26 and thinking about the broader environmental and development commitments related to global trade as well as food systems, today's webinar will explore the outlook for trade policies in relation to biodiversity and climate change. So before we begin, I would quickly like to cover some housekeeping. We'd like to notify you that today's session will be recorded and made available on the Trade Hub YouTube channel. Your microphone will be muted and your camera will be off during the webinar. If you would like to comment or ask a question, and we definitely encourage you to do that, please type it in the chat function throughout the session. And if your question is to a particular speaker, please include their names, and I will then pick up some of these questions during our moderator discussion session. If you do have any technical difficulties at all, you'll see in the participant list that we have technical support, Cecilia, and you can send her a direct message via chat to help you out. So without further ado then, I would like to introduce our first speaker. He is Professor Tim Benton, Research Director for Emerging Risks and the Director for the Environment and Society Program at Chatham House. And Chatham House is also a partner of the GCRF Trade Hub. He's a professor and former Dean for Strategic Research at the University of Leeds and a former champion of the UK's Global Food Security Program, and among many other posts he holds, he's also a member of the UK Government Task Force on Sustainable Supply Chains, called the Global Resource Initiative. At COP26, he was also the co-lead of a high-level dialogue that the GCRF Trade Hub co-hosted as well, which was answering the question, how can cooperation on trade support climate action and sustainable development? I think he might have just recuperated from the past 2 weeks in Glasgow, but over to you, Tim. I'll hand over to you now for some stage setting on our topic today.
Thanks, Amaya. So I've got 4 minutes to, just give a top of mind about what I felt about COP. I very much welcomed that nature was present in a meaningful sense, particularly in avoided deforestation. And sustainable trade was evident, not just in our high-level panel, but in various places. And I think Simon will talk about it again in a minute. There was also progress in the net zero pledges, a little progress on the NDCs, and the suggested new cycle of ambition. So there were some good things that happened. Campaigns and declarations were plentiful, perhaps too many of them even, from the Glasgow Breakthrough Agenda, which covered a little bit of sustainable agriculture, via the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, as well as the FACT Roadmap, and the Glasgow Declaration on Fair Water Footprints. Many, many, many of these happened, and many of these carry strong political signals. However, as many commentators have said, long-term goals and pledges are not action, so proof will be in the pudding in the sense of the actions that need to be taken as we run up to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. I think my major issue, which pertains to trade, is that food systems and diets were absent from discussions, especially given that 35% of emissions are related to the food system. It is perhaps unsurprising that the focus has been on tackling the sources of emissions rather than the market and consumer drivers for them. Thus, food has never been in focus, is not in focus at the moment. Rather, it's the emissions that come from various forms of land use relating to agriculture and forestry that are the consensus of discussion. This, of course, leads to a concentration on supply, the agricultural outputs, rather than modifying the drivers of demand in terms of transforming diets for the benefit of people. And the latter might be seen to be going against the ideology of the market, which and the importance of economic growth, which drives a lot of the discussions. Framing the issues as a supply side problem prompts attention to the quantities of production rather than the qualities of production. It's all about driving up productivity. It's not about driving the right sorts of things being produced in the right sorts of places in the right sorts of ways. There was no recognition, and this is a shame given that we've spent many years arguing for food systems views in this regard, that driving per capita demand growth for agricultural commodities through innovating in supply just ends up undermining health systems around the world directly and indirectly. And there was no recognition that the land sparing of forests and therefore the intensification of agricultural land left will ratchet up further problems. My own view is that we need more consideration than productivity increases in major commodities. We ought to be considering what is grown and how it's grown. Relatively little attention is still being given to the implications of such choices of what is grown on climate change, biodiversity, human health and well-being. As the PM said at COP26, his vision is for guilt-free flying and guilt-free chocolate underpinned by a science and technology and science and innovation agenda, not for trying to reduce demand. So my sum up really is that progress at COP was in forest conservation, in investing in sustainable intensification, some momentum on trade, but no progress yet in thinking about the demand shifting in order to save space, save pressure on land, nourish us and the planet. Over.
Thank you very much, Tim. I think our next speaker will follow on very nicely to what you've said then. And I'll go on to introducing him straight away. He is Simon Sharp, the Deputy Director for Policy Campaigns for COP26 of the Cabinet Office of the UK. Before this, he was the Head of International Climate Change Strategy at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, or BEIS, of the UK government. And he also previously served in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office with postings in China and India, and led on climate change strategy in the run-up to the Paris Agreement as well. He's also served as Head of Private Office to the Ministers of State for Energy and Climate Change and led work on clean growth in the UK's industrial strategy. And among many other, and this is also among many other academic publications and work he's done. So I think it's really wonderful to have you with us today, Simon. I don't know whether you've actually still recuperated from COP26, but we will hand over to you now to talk about some of the outcomes that Tim has already brought up. And I think you have a little more detail on a couple of them as well.
Thanks, Amaya. Yeah, my body is somewhat collapsing after COP, so that's why I'm a little bit growly. It's hard to follow Tim on this. Tim is a deep expert and someone I've learned a lot from on this agenda. But I think I'll start with setting out what I think was the most significant progress forward at COP, and then maybe at the end I'll come back to Tim's comments. As Tim said, we had this global leaders declaration on forests and land use, which was supported by around 140 countries, which together cover more than 90% of the forests on the earth. And they agreed to work together to halt and reverse forest loss and land degradation by 2030. I think one thing that's significant about that, not only is it the strongest political declaration there's ever been on ending forest loss, halting and reversing it. Also, if you compare it to any of the other sectors where global emissions are coming from, there's really a unique consensus on the pace of the change that we need. You don't have that level of consensus in any single one of the other emitting sectors. So in terms of a political signal and a joint commitment, it's really strong. Quite rightly, everybody has asked, well, what basis do we have for any confidence that that goal could be met, especially given the way we've set similar goals in the New York Forest Declaration in 2014 and they weren't met. And there are many different aspects to it, but to me, trade is actually the most important lever, the most important piece of the puzzle that we have to get right to give ourselves a chance. And in the 2 years leading up to COP26 and at the COP itself, we've had a serious effort to engage with trade. And the reason is, when you look at the agricultural commodities whose production relates to a high proportion of deforestation, especially tropical deforestation, you find that the financial value of the flows of these commodities is about 100 times the amount of finance that goes to protecting those forests. And so if you don't align the trade with the protection of the forests, then I think protection of the forest will remain a dream and not a reality. So this was an absolute critical thing to do. And when we looked at this problem, and we talked to people who've worked on this for much longer, and the multi-stakeholder networks of expertise from industry and civil society, the Tropical Forest Alliance being one we work with very closely, then they all set out a fairly common set of elements of the problem. One, agreeing on standards so that what is allowed to be traded and imported matches what's allowed to be produced, and that both of those correspond to something that is sustainable. That's clearly something that countries have to agree internationally. Second, that you have transparency and traceability throughout the supply chains so that you can tell what's met the standard and what hasn't. And that can't just be voluntary, it has to be led by governments, making plain to industry what information has to be made available. Third, support to smallholder farmers to help them raise their productivity, increase their incomes at the same time as meeting standards of sustainability that the global market expects. And fourth, aligning research and development efforts to accelerate innovation, increasing resilience and productivity. And we see that there is some precedent for at least some of those elements coming together before. The EU's forest law enforcement governance and trade mechanism agreed standards and agreed governance systems for one commodity, timber, and it did it bilaterally between the EU and a few other commodity producing countries. We think that's a good precedent because to some extent it worked. We think it actually, when it was emulated by other countries, it did make some progress in keeping particularly illegally harvested timber off global markets. What we think needs to be done, and what the forest agriculture and commodity trade dialogue is working to do, is bring about some similar partnership like that between producer and consumer countries, but do it plurilaterally instead of bilaterally. And instead of just covering one commodity, timber, actually cover the range of the main forest risk commodities. And we think that that plurilateral approach is really essential because you need a level playing field. Otherwise, sustainably produced commodities get undercut by the unsustainable ones. And so it's also critical for effectiveness to shift enough of the global market that we actually do protect the forests. So at COP26, the countries that have been involved in this, there are 28 countries part of the Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Dialogue, the FACT dialogue, and they brought out a roadmap that just set out some of those elements that they're going to be working on together in the coming years. I think nobody who works in this field expects all of that to happen really quickly. The political sensitivities and difficulties and interests at stake are huge. But we took a lot of encouragement from the fact that the major producer and consumer countries are involved in that dialogue. They have built a certain amount of trust working together over the 2 years so far. There seems to be a real commitment about taking that forward together. So that, I think, it is a really serious attempt to solve the problem. It does put trade right at the heart of it. And I think we'll need support from all of this community to help make it successful over the coming years. I'll make a final quick point in response.
A very quick one, sure, go ahead.
Very quick. Of course, I know that Tim is right, that the demand side matters enormously as well. The consumption matters enormously. I'd just say one reason why we focused on the supply side is really that's where there seemed to be the most leverage for diplomacy. Bringing countries together, you could agree an approach to trade and these other elements that would help to significantly make a dent in the problem of deforestation. Whereas that shift to healthier diets feels like something that needs to be pushed much more on a national level by national governments.
I think that's something we'll definitely pick up once again during the moderator discussion as well. But thank you very much, Simon, for elaborating on what was a very important pledge that came out of the COP26 proceedings. And we'll pick up again on these things, but I think we'll move swiftly on to Harry, who will also be commenting from an Indonesian perspective. So up next, we have Prof. Harry Purnomo, who is a senior scientist at C4ICRAF in Indonesia. That's the Center for International Forestry Research and World Agroforestry. And he's a professor at the Faculty of Forestry and Environment at IPB University, Indonesia. He leads various research projects on the value chains, finance and investment teams at C4ICRAF, and that includes the GCRF Trade Hub. He has many specializations he's working on, but within the Trade Hub, he leads the coordination of our Indonesia research partners and also leads on Indonesian palm oil research. So Harry, it's a pleasure to have you here with us. I know it's a little late in Jakarta right now, but thank you for joining us. And over to you for some comments on linking Indonesia and the reaction that you've had so far to the environmental and development commitments. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Amaya. First, I would like to follow up what Simon mentioned. Actually, Indonesia, the president of Jokowi, is one of the world leaders who declared ending deforestation in 2030 during G20 in Rome, as well as COP26 in Glasgow. And also we have to congratulate Indonesia for able to reduce deforestation to almost 1/3 from 2019 to 2020, as well as reducing forest fire and also carbon emission. And also the minister mentioned would like to call it a forest and then use net zero carbon. And also a lot of happening actually in Indonesia now, and the Ministry of Finance actually would like to implement carbon tax in 2022, as well as a clear regulation coming from the president on the carbon economic value. I think all is going to the same direction, I believe. But the second point is actually we need to some kind of collaborative monitoring. Sometimes the data that provided by government is not agreed by Greenpeace, for instance. So in the future, we need to come up with collaborative monitoring tools. And the third one actually going to palm oil. I think there is a lucrative business. Actually, Indonesia exported $25 billion annually, coming from palm oil to the world. Yeah. And also, I calculated around 300 million tons of carbon emission in the supply chains of the palm oil. Yeah. And also 2 million hectares now where palm is located on a peatland. How to move forward with this kind of situation, as well as 3 million hectares located in forest area. And a lot of smallholders. It's not a rich farmer, but sometimes poor farmer located in the forest area. And a lot of government actually is doing, but not 100% successfully. But I would like to mention in palm oil now in Indonesia is very different from the oil palm in, say, 20 or 30 years ago. 20 years ago, a lot of oil palm actually the land coming from forest, but now is less of oil palm coming from forest. I think more coming from the other agricultural. That's the third one. The fourth one, I would like also to second to Simon the importance of certification, the standard, both for large enterprises, also for the smallholder. The smallholder is quite complicated because of the cost to bear the certification. But I would like to mention that this commitment, certification matter. I have a research in South Sumatra, actually, how the commitment coming from public, especially private sector, is able to reduce deforestation. So do not undermine the importance of certification in reducing deforestation. And the last one is on the jurisdictional approach. Yeah. For Indonesia, is a lot of initiative coming from the local government, the district government, also the young leaders. Yeah. So they would like to be memorized as environmental leaders. Yeah. So I would like to recognize like this Siak government in South Sumatra, in Rio, as well as South Kalimantan is promoting a green growth and development, as well as some area in Papua. They have called it the Manokwari Declaration. It is the initiative coming from local government as well as NGO at the local level. I think that's all what I would like to say, Amaya, for time being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. Thank you for bringing in those important perspectives on progress already made, as well as about the different stakeholders that we need to be reaching out to, from civil society to local government. So very good to have your comments there. I'll move swiftly on to Angela now. So next up, we have Angela Francis, who is the Chief Advisor for Economics and Economic Development at WWF UK, where she provides economic advice across the climate, food, and nature programs, as well as leading on trade and industrial policy for a green transition. So WWF UK is also another Trade Hub partner. So it's been fantastic to have Angela's expertise on the project so far and going forwards as well. She herself started out as an accountant in the energy industry before moving into economic development, where she has spent the last 18 years. And among other roles she has held, she was previously regional economist and climate attaché for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the Caribbean, and also the chief economist for the Green Alliance. So I think, Angela, you'll be drawing on your work and giving us more of a perspective from sustainable agriculture and strengthening our discourse in this way. So over to you.
Thank you, Amaya. Thank you, and great to join this panel. It's a fantastic discussion following on from COP. If I say a little bit about where my perspective comes into this, as an economist, as opposed to a sort of a trade specialist, I'm looking at the difference between trade, you know, the stuff that happens, the flows between buyers and organizations, and countries' trade policy or the international trade system. So the overall incentives and rules set by governments. And I want to talk about that because I think that whilst trade is moving in some good directions, the overall systems and policies could do with a bit of a change to help us move in the right direction. And the difference, I think, often between a trade specialist perspective and a wider economist perspective is the trade system is designed to optimize between current producers. It assumes that markets are working and it reduces the barriers so that the benefits of those production systems spread. Whereas economists look at that, of course, there's huge benefits to trade, but they also look at where those markets need adjusting and where you have to reshape things to deliver optimal outcomes. And I think reflects on what was said earlier on about how we use all the things we use to preference sustainable production over unsustainable production. And that's really important when you're driving a transition. So when there are better, greener, safer, more resilient economic outcomes come from taxing or regulating environmental harms, and countries are doing that at different rates, and some of them aren't doing it at all, trade's got this really powerful role to play. But trade specialists, I would say, are not used to really flexing their muscles on these kinds of systems. And some of them haven't probably even really accepted that's the job for them to do yet. They're much more comfortable with the solutions that are around liberalisation. So liberalisation is fantastic when you've got a very definitive green tech or service. But trade rules are not as good at curtailing, I would say, the kind of redundant products or practices, the closing off demand for the dirty polluting processes that we want to take off the system. But those shaping and that directing of markets is a really vital tool for economic policy, and something that's going to have to be really well used by governments in the 10 years, this decade of action that follows COP. So in the trade world, a lot of these tools are actually seen as trade barriers, and they're seen as tools of protectionism, and it's all seen as our farmers against your farmers and a national interest. Whereas from a wider economic lens, I think it's seen as modern regenerative agriculture against industrial conventional agriculture, which is out of balance of nature, and it's not working for us. I'm positive about this because I think things are starting to change. So governments around the world are working out how their trade policies are going to work for them, and how ambitious countries aren't going to be held back by countries that aren't acting, and how countries who are at the forefront of environmental action are driving down their own territorial environmental impacts, but they're also looking at the wider footprint and of their consumption, and how they can use that as a positive motivator. And this is all part of a 21st century trade agenda. And I think really important actually in rebuilding faith that the international trade system works on these big challenges we have. If international trade doesn't help us move towards a green economy, it's not going to be much use for us. So I'm very quickly say, in terms of the UK case study, the UK is doing a number of things really well in this space on trade. It's doing a number of things on the, how do we act on trade? How do we look at how things are produced? So we're looking at our own agricultural reform in the UK. We're focusing on public money for public goods, which is a system that preferences and supports farmers for clean water, air, habitats, and carbon sinks. All great. It's doing lots of things on passing laws around deforestation-free supply chains. And we're expecting a footprint target to follow. And as Simon has detailed, and we're doing a fantastic bit of work around co-sponsor of FACT. Excuse me, I hope you can't hear that announcement in the background. The UK has not reflected any of this sustainable production and consumption thinking in our trade policy yet. And arguably, I'd say it's actually making it worse. So the UK is liberalising all of our food and drinks markets without setting any environmental criteria. Our first agreement in principle with Australia is, which has got lots of fantastic farmers in Australia who are trying to do things differently, not least because they're suffering the effects of climate change. I'm very sorry, there's an alarm going off next to me. I'll carry on talking, I hope you can hear me. There's lots of farmers trying to do things differently in Australia, not least because they're experiencing the experience of climate change and forest fires. But most of the agricultural kind of baseline in Australia is quite low. And the UK has given the best offer it could give, zero tariff, zero quota access to that farming system is undermining the confidence of the rest of the farmers who actually want to be supported and rewarded for doing better. So there's a lot more the UK could do in getting its trade system, as I say, to sort of flex its muscles on that. And I could say more in questions about why this is a missed opportunity, but we think that sustainable agriculture and rewarding it is a really important complement to the work that UK is doing on deforestation. It brings in all countries rather than just those that have still got standing forests, and I think that's really important from a global justice point of view. And it's a really important complement to all the work that's happening on carbon border adjustments, which is very important and totally support, but is a potentially a too narrow a lens for agriculture, which has got so many other environmental impacts apart from carbon, which we also need to take account of. So I can say more on that as we get into debate, but I think the UK has got lots of reasons to actually put itself at the forefront of taking forward trade. So it's setting the incentives for sustainable agriculture in a way that it's poised to do, but isn't quite taking advantage of yet. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. And we did hear you there through the alarm, so no problem at all. Thank you for continuing, but fantastic perspectives that you brought in there for the importance of not just focusing on deforestation, but sustainable agriculture as a whole. And now we have Marcelo Furtado. Marcelo is a chemical engineer by training, but he has over 30 years of experience working in the sustainability field, committed to advancing environmental and social justice through advocacy as well as philanthropy. He's an ambassador for finance for biodiversity, a founding partner at the startup Blocksy, which is a traceability platform for environmental assets using blockchain technology. And he's also the co-founder of the Brazilian Coalition on Climate, Forest and Agriculture, which is a multi-stakeholder forum with representatives from academia, business and civil society. And that's focused on land use issues as well as establishing a sustainable low carbon economy. So he's also the founder and head of many other think tanks and bodies focused on just these topics. Also served as the executive director of Greenpeace Brazil, and he spent 4 years at Greenpeace, and he's also the current board chair at the World Resources Institute for Brazil. So it's fantastic to have your expertise as well on this panel, Marcelo. And I'll hand over to you now to talk to us a little bit today about traceability, transparency, and accountability. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, my dear panelists, for all the great insights I've heard from you. Listening to this panel, I always like to remember to our audience that there's a difference between doing things right and doing the right things. And I think oftentimes we as society miss the point because we keep trying to do things right and we forget what are the right things to do. And I think the COP26 is a good example of many attempts to do things right, but missing on what are the right things to do. The elements of traceability, accountability, transparency have been subject to discussion for many years. But I think that with the evolution of technology, they became so much easier and cheaper to be deployed that I would say that today there is no excuse for not having those elements embedded into trade. And if we were to have that, we could have not only a better measurement of impact and ambition, but moreover, I think we could address this key question that Tim, Simon, Angela, and Harry brought up constantly in this conversation, which was the issue of having good standards for evaluating and monitoring this among different countries. Therefore, the question that arises is, okay, if technology is not the issue, if the cost of monitoring is not the issue, what is the real issue? And I think the real issue is political will. And despite the fact that I do think that there were some progress at COP26, the main question relies on, is there political will to engage on the transformation we need? And let me make a pause there to explain what I mean by that. I think we have done a great effort defining what the problem is, and we know that we need a major energy transition, we need a major urban transition, and we need a major food transition. Those are the three major systems that we need to change. And we also have a lot of data that indicates where we need to land in 2030 and in 2050. But what we do not spend too much time talking about is how we're going to do this transition. And the way we can do that transition with equity, with speed, and with environmental and scientific consistency is extremely important. And that is the conversation that we're doing least. I would be a little bit more optimistic, Tim, than you on the role of food at COP26, because I think I participated in many debates where this was discussed. But you're right, if we were to say, okay, for people that are outside our bubble, one thing is the negotiation which happened in a specific area in Glasgow. The other one is all the activities that happened led by civil society, academia, private sector, and even governments that in their own stance, they had a very wide scope conversation, but in their negotiation, they had a very narrow scope conversation. And I think we need to bridge these two things. And to bridge those two things, it seems to me that the only pressure point, the only engagement point that we can get is if we are clear about what are the indicators of positive impact that we are expecting. So to finalize my introduction here, Amaya, I would say that we have history of the soya moratoria in Brazil, the beef moratoria. We know how to curb deforestation. We have great satellite monitoring in Brazil to do so. We have incredible political will from civil society and the Brazilian population, for example, where they understood that when inflation goes up is bad, and similarly, when deforestation rate goes up is bad. It's embedded in general society, the concept that you need to end deforestation. And that is how we're going to move forward. But the challenge for trade is to, as much as punish the illegal commodities, is how do you enforce, how do you welcome, how do you put value on nature-based products, products that carry water, environmental services, and so much benefits. And in rewarding that, how you make sure that the reward is properly distributed. Because after all, many of the key players, indigenous peoples, forest communities, farmers, are not benefiting from that system. So I would argue, following to what Angela said, that the trade system has a huge responsibility to shape the future we want.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, for wrapping up our comments from the panelists so well. And I think, really bringing home the points that other speakers have touched on as well. And coming from your perspective, from the civil society perspective as well, I think was very, very important to bring in there. I think what we'll do now is move on to the moderated panel discussion. I think there were many things we mentioned there that needed to be brought up once again and have reactions to what everyone said. So I think we're going to spotlight all the panelists now and have a discussion. And I see that some questions have already come in through the chat, and we ask that you keep putting in your questions through chat. So I will actually pick up on a question that came in earlier through the chat. This was directed to Simon, but I think others can also chip in. But there was a question that came up about speaking about the unilateral, or I think you mentioned bilateral agreement that the EU had brought in on illegal timber, and asking the question, why is it only illegal timber that's considered here when any sort of deforestation makes any other commodity sort of undesirable? So why is there a legal timber and illegal timber discussion at all when any sort of deforestation should be considered? And I think that brings into the wider sort of ambiguity around some of the languages in the pledges, for instance, where there were questions about, are we talking about zero deforestation? Are we talking about net deforestation? When it comes to specifically the things like the pledge on deforestation that took place. So do you have any comments on that from what you've seen in the discussions in COP26?
Yeah, definitely. I think what we need is for three things to converge. One of those is the products that are given market access in consumer countries. The second thing is production that is considered legal in producer countries. And the third is what we consider sustainable, as in, not creating deforestation. To solve the problem of forest loss, you need those three things to converge. You need them all to be the same. The question is, how do you get there if all of those three things are completely different? And I think what's at the heart of this is a question about whether you need producer and consumer countries to work on this together. Because you can look at the EU right now and the EU's new proposals on legislation to avoid products that have caused deforestation being placed on the EU market. And to some extent, that's a fairly unilateral approach. And some of the EU's representatives are saying, look, we're not just stopping at legality, we're going beyond that, we're going towards sustainability. But I think there's a serious question about whether, as a consumer importer country, you can actually set your own definition of sustainability and implement that without doing so in partnership with a producer country, setting a different standard from what that producer country considers acceptable. It's going to be difficult to do in practical terms if countries are not aligned on what they're trying to achieve and the governance mechanisms to achieve it. You've also got to ask the question whether other major consumer countries would be on board with that approach. If you're not taking a partnership approach, can you expect that consumers like China and India will come with you? I would say probably not. So when we looked at this as the UK, we very much agreed that it's sustainability that matters, and that's where we're all trying to get to. But we thought it's very hard to see a plausible route to getting there that doesn't involve working with producer and consumer countries together.
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I think that really gives that the perspectives that, or rather the two sides of the coin that we need to be addressing. But Tim, I wonder whether you feel that then comes back to what you mentioned before about modifying the drivers of demand, and that being one of the main things to tackle.
Yes and no. I think there is an ultimate question around sustainability, which is not just production. It is whether you should be producing whatever good you are producing in the first place. And we got some kind of movement on that with respect to phasing down coal and the launch of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance. And I'm just wondering if in years to come, we will say that producing this sort of food versus that sort of food comes with too high an environmental cost. But with respect to the specific question around the illegal timber, of course, there is the sovereignty of producer countries. And if they've already made a sovereign decision that it is illegal to extract timber, then we can support them in upholding their laws. If we are telling them that they can't cut down timber and it's not illegal in their country, then of course that raises all sorts of issues to do with national sovereignty and particularly the colonialism of our Western market. But I saw Angela had her finger up, and I would love to hear her response to that question.
Thanks both. Yeah, I think the legality point's been covered, and you guys know more about that than I do. But I think on the multilateral, unilateral point, I think it's worth really examining the transition routes we've got here, because, of course, any country that wants to express its sustainability needs to do that in cooperation with other countries. But I do worry that if our only route is by multilateral agreement on everything, we will always move at the speed of the slowest. And in some respects, what trade rules can do by showing sustainability is reinforcing what market demand is doing, but doing it in a much more consistent way that's much easier to kind of navigate around in terms of a trade system than the proliferation of kind of voluntary systems that we have that are trying to reflect sustainability. So I don't think it's the case that unilateral action should be ruled out. It just has to be done very, very smartly. And one of the reasons I'm quite keen on the UK being an actor in this is because we wouldn't just be doing what we're doing on deforestation, which is very good and very important, but we could also be doing stuff on sustainable agriculture, which I think brings in Marcelo's point, which I loved, about how you reward. So deforestation is often about what you stop, that sustainable agriculture is what we want to start. And it's the places where you could say, we want to preference, we want to give access, we want to give something to the people who are producing in ways that's consistent with living alongside habitats and standing forests, rather than giving something to farmers who are farming in a way this is a characterization, but slash and burn farming, which we want to move away from. And the thing that I think is very helpful about it, I alluded to in my first point, is it isn't just slash and burn farming that's the problem. It's also farming that's happening in developed countries, which have already slashed and burned 100 years ago. What they're doing is able to farm in a very profitable way, commercially profitable way, by having a monocrop farming system, no space for habitat, no nature, lots of use of pesticides and fertilizers, which is setting a price point that governs the market and makes everybody else sort of work towards that. So we need, if we talk about what sustainable agriculture we want, we're able to bring those type of producers into the system, which includes the EU, but it also includes the US and Australia and New Zealand and others who, can tick along quite nicely with a business as usual agriculture model, unless somebody starts to say that isn't what we want anymore, we're not going to reward that type of farming. And we let the farmers in those countries who are also trying to move, it's not those US farmers and Australian farmers who are trying to do something different, and they need a signal from the market that says that is what we want, please go ahead, please invest, please innovate in that space. And we're starting to curtail and close down the space for the people who aren't doing that. So I think that's a plea that unilateralism shouldn't be dismissed, because I think actually it does take some countries to start to send those really strong signals that that's where we're going to move things quickly.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. Marcelo, you had something to add on there.
No, I just wanted to make a provocation here, because I think that it's also probably not enough to look only at the producer and consumer elements, because we're talking about a system change. And in a system change, we have a whole number of players throughout the value chain of the entire commodity that we're talking about. So I would like to invite us to consider two different challenges. One is, in the transformation process that we are undergoing, I would say that trade has a lot to be blamed for the problems we have today, because it was never designed to actually neither value nature nor reward who's doing the right thing. In fact, every time you established a new barrier of this is no longer acceptable, the premium for whoever was doing right never showed up, and all you did was close the market for who was doing it wrong. And if that wrongdoing is on an illegality basis, that's absolutely acceptable. But if that wrongdoing is because there was a scientific improvement, there was a different technology change that did not lend to the other side, that is absolutely unfair. So I would like to provoke here and hear a little bit from Professor Purnomo and maybe from Tim Benton. The question is, how can trade be shifted? If you imagine a pyramid where nature is on the bottom and finance is on the top, what if we were to flip the pyramid and say, why don't we put finance in the bottom and nature on the top? Because at the end of the day, without nature, there will be no trade, because there will be no planet.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. I'll transfer that provocation to Harry. And he mentioned already about the smallholders and the certification schemes and those who are losing out. And I think you can elaborate then based on what Marcelo's question as well, Harry.
Yeah, first, the sustainability is not easy for smallholders that are located in the forest area. So we have to do a lot of facilitation and provide the green investment, and also the budget coming from the government. Also would like to comment that the transition from the existing economy to the new economy post COP26. Whatever we will do, we have to believe it is under the resilience of political economic system in one country. Because if it is more than that the country can be chaotic, right? If it cannot be absorbed by the economic system. And I remember the huge deforestation in Indonesia, not happening now actually, but happening was in 1998 and 1999 when there was a political economic crisis. So this is a lot of deforestation happening at that time. And also I would like to mention the role of the traders of the carbon, because now the CO2 carbon credit is very cheap, as Marcelo mentioned, as we value the carbon credit is very, very low. So how to increase, and also remember the initiative coming from Singapore, actually, how to increase the price of carbon, because now it's $5 per ton of carbon or CO2, and not much actually is ready to access for everyone. So make sure that the carbon credit, the money accessible for everyone, particularly for smallholder, and also easy to access it. So that's I believe that the ending deforestation will happen. And also I would like to underline the timber trade. Actually, Indonesia, EU, and UK agree on the flat fee, that every timber coming from Indonesia pass the legality standard, and it is based on 13 years discussion between UK, EU, and Indonesia. It's not unilaterally determined by consumer, but also by producing country, because we need to get a support from the people of Indonesia in relation of the timber trade. If the producer country people as not government people do not support whatever transition, I think it's quite difficult to get whatever we want in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. Tim, do you have anything to add on there to what Harry's just said from an Indonesia perspective?
Well, I mean, we can talk about this till the cows come home, really. But I think the fundamental issue that Marcelo raises is that, to a certain extent, A, we don't value the future, so we are willing to squander our natural capital to make money today. And partly, our ideology is that wealth creation is the most important thing that we can do. And, you know, as a professor of ecology and by heart a Malthusian, if you have positive economic growth based on consumption growth, that implies exponential increase in consumption, exponential increase in resources, and on a finite planet, something's eventually got to give. So I think part of the challenge is, how do we either change the discount rate that we use that allows us to say, well, this is a problem for the future, and if we invest in science and technology today, then eventually we will decouple our consumption growth, economic growth from our consumption growth through the kind of whole technology optimism. Or how do we internalize the externalities in a way that doesn't give a $5 a ton carbon cost when the real social cost is, you know, probably more like $500 a ton. And, you know, just as an aside, you know, we've done a lot of work, as Simon knows, on climate risks, and one of our colleagues, Teng Fei in Tsinghua University, has recently estimated that even with that incredibly conservative estimate, the economic cost to China by the end of the century of climate change, if we deviate from a 1.5 pathway, is in the order of upwards of $100 trillion cumulative. So the costs of not changing are so huge that it comes down to the issue that our methods of estimating the value of today's unsustainable extraction is just plain wrong. So I think there is an ideological issue, but there is also an economic issue about how do we get that estimation right of tomorrow's costs against today's value. Over.
Can I jump in here, Maya, as well?
Go ahead, yes.
Just, I think that's absolutely right, and I think Marcelo's raising a very good point. My sort of split of this is not like future against now. I think it's incumbents against disruptors. Like, there are people in the system who have seen the writing on the wall for their food production system. If you're a food business, you know you need to act on this. You know, there is no sustainable system for you to be able to satisfy your customers if you're basically sort of driving us off the cliff in terms of nature and climate change. But we've got so much embedded sort of, you know, assets around the system we've got, and shifting. It's like, for me, it's like fossil fuels, renewables. Conventional agriculture is the fossil fuels. We need to get off the system, and it's really, really hard because it's for most people, farming is like a lovely, lovely industry. It's all very nice. But there's two different ways of doing it, and getting towards regenerative agriculture and separating that and understanding how to incentivize that and put other types of agriculture out of the system is proving, I think, harder psychologically and sort of methodologically than it should. But I think we've said here, certification exists, the modeling exists, we know where we need to get to. I think we just need to be now very, very clear that's where we're going to. And I think it takes a couple of countries, particularly the UK, that started to move towards a regenerative agriculture system and move towards sustainable supply chains, to start saying this is the direction of travel. And it won't take very long for lots of other countries to move, but we do need to start doing that.
Countries and companies as well. I think there's a comment that's come in through the track there about the whole that traders, for instance, have as sort of bottlenecks almost in the global trade supply system, isn't it? Where all the production goes through them all the supply and production goes through them to the consumers. But Marcelo, you had something to add there as well.
No, because I use a lot, Angela, the same analogy of fossil fuels and renewables for the food transition. And I think it's important for our audience to remember that there is no one solution. We're talking about a mosaic of solutions. When we're talking about alternative proteins, if we pick one winner, we're just going to create a new problem. But if we understand that the solution will be a mix of different technologies applied in different countries in different ways, then we have a chance of really making that shift. Now, I agree with you that countries like EU, US, UK play a very important role on this as buyers and asset owners and investors, which is a very important word that we have not said here till now. But I also have to say that we as producing countries such as Brazil, we have a lot to gain from becoming a country that bets on alternative proteins and regenerative agriculture, a more sustainable agriculture, and so on. So I think it's not naive to say that we can have a resilient economy that produces jobs and income and produces food in a sustainable way without disrupting the system, because the disruption we want is to change the status quo, as you said. But the disruption we don't want is to make food inaccessible and with a price that poor people cannot pay for, therefore driving hunger, and worst, and not addressing the nutritional needs of society, and they're creating different health problems. So as important as it is to make change happen, is to be very watchful on how the shape of the transformation happens. And ultimately, I think the pressure on having support from society for this, that Professor Purnomo was saying, is so important, because it's not only a driver for making governments do the right thing, but also is a driver for us as civil society, academia, and private sector to engage on that transformation. And I think that there are very few companies, very few organizations, and not enough studies in academia to help us do a safe and sustainable transition.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. I think my last question was going to be this pithy question about what's the one factor you think that could change the trade trajectory to become more climate and nature positive. But I think you've given us many factors there, bringing in all these different stakeholders that really show us how this changing of tides can happen. I mean, I think, like Tim said, we could talk about this until the cows come home. But unfortunately for us, our time here on the webinar today has come to an end. A very, very big thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. I think you've made my job very easy by being so sort of eloquent in putting together why this is such an important discussion to have at this point in time. So thank you very much to Simon, Tim, Angela, Harry, and Marcelo. And thank you to our audience who have participated today. The recording of today's webinar will be available yes, Tim, on the Trade Hub YouTube channel, for which the link will hopefully come up in the chat box right now, as well as previous webinars we've had from the Trade and Nature series as well. The next event we're organizing through the Trade Hub is on the 3rd of December, where the Trade Hub is doing a session at the 12th World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference. Our session is titled, appropriately, Minimum Environmental Standards at the WTO. What's the way to avoid a fractured environmental turn of trade policy that disadvantages vulnerable developing countries? And I think Angela is going to be on that panel once again too, so you can see and hear from her again. The link to register for that is in the chat box too. If you wish to stay updated about the GCRF Trade Hub project, please visit our website or follow us on social media. And once again, thank you all for your attendance today. Thank you to the panelists. I wish you a nice day, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are. And we'll see you again at our next webinar.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thanks to you.
Thanks all. Bye.